Thanks so much for joining us for our webinar, Why Aren't More Children's Books Published in Translation? This webinar is brought to you by the Bookseller magazine and the Sheikh Zayed Book Awards, an annual portfolio of 9 book prizes, 2 of which center around children's literature and translation. Over the next hour, we will be discussing the state of translation in children's literature. Why aren't more kids' books published in translation? What are the challenges facing the global market for children's translation? What are the positives and benefits of books crossing cultures? To unpack these and more questions, we've assembled a top-notch panel of experts. First is Salwa Shakhshir, who is the managing director of Salwa Publishers, the Jordanian kids specialist which publishes from board books to YA. Since its founding in 1996, Salwa has established itself as one of the leading children's publishers in the Arab world, claiming a number of awards, and apropos for the discussion, has had many titles translated into foreign language. Hi, Salwa.
Hi.
Make us all jealous here in the UK by telling us how good the weather is in Jordan at the moment.
It's actually t-shirt weather, I heard, but it's also a bit not good, obviously, because of the lack of rainfall and the lack of water.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, great to have you with us. The next is Tom Bonnick. Thank you. The next is Tom Bonnick, who is the senior commissioning editor and business development manager at Nosy Crow, the UK's multi-award-winning indie kids publisher. Tom joined Nosy Crow in 2011 and commissions fiction and manages the audio list. Among his many personal awards were being named Young Independent Publisher of the Year at the Independent Publishers Guild Awards and to the Booksellers Rising Stars list in 2016. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you for having me.
I imagine, Tom, that being on the Booksellers Rising Stars list was the pinnacle of your career, and it will never be.
It was. It's, yeah, the star has been in descendant ever since, I think. Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Thanks for joining us. And Pam Dix, who is the UK chair of IBI, the International Board of Books for Young People, and has worked as a librarian and a lecturer in children's literature. Her work for IBI includes helping organize its biennial conference at the Bologna Children's Book Fair. And again, apropos for this discussion, Pam has edited the proceedings of the IBI 2016 World Congress, which was published as Children's Literature in a Multi-Literate World. She also works with 2 charities involved with library and book revisions in sub-Saharan Africa. Hi, Pam. I bet you're very anxious to get back to Bologna in 2022.
Anxious to get back to Bologna and to do a bit more traveling, I must say. I mean, you can make these connections remotely, but there's nothing quite like being on the ground working with people. It's the creative networks that I miss, you know, the creative conversations that happen outside the Zoom, really. So I'm looking forward to traveling next year, I hope.
All right, brilliant. And welcome to you, the panelists, and welcome to everyone who's joined. Before we go on, just a bit of housekeeping. We'd love to take questions from you, the audience, at the end. Please feel free to put those in the chat function. If you do have a question, could you just put them in all caps, just so it's easier for us to look out for them. There's also a simultaneous Arabic translation, which you can access at the bottom of the Zoom. And also we will be putting the webinar up on the Booksellers YouTube channel, perhaps an hour or so after this ends. So please tell your friends, family, and colleagues who couldn't make it that they can still tune in. We'll tweet out the links to that as soon as we're able. Okay, great. So why don't I guess we should just start with the big picture sort of deal. What do each of you think is the sort of, from your unique perspectives, the sort of total landscape of children's literature and translation at the moment? We've sort of kind of geared it as why aren't more children's books being published in translation? And I just to set the tone, perhaps a bad tone, I ran some numbers on UK translation. And the top selling children's book in the UK for 2021 in translation is Marcus Pfister's Rainbow Frisk, great book, but it's in 685th place. And looking at the top 5,000 best-selling titles of the year for children's, it's tough to say because this is an easy thing to look up, but probably less than 1% of the children's books in the UK are in translation. So we have a long way to go in the UK at least. But Pam, why don't you kick us off? What do you think is the sort of big picture look at translation from particularly from your IBI perspective?
Thank you. Well, it's interesting that you think it's still 1%, because when I was teaching, I used to think it was 1 to 2%, and I'd hoped the situation was improving. But the fact that we're not absolutely sure is probably an indication that we need a bit more information about it. I suppose for me, the starting point, I mean, I'd like to quote the principal of one of the very rural schools I work with in Kenya, who said to me years ago, I can't make my children be citizens of the world if they don't read the world's literature. And I thought that was wonderful to hear from him, and really encapsulated my position, really, that if we want to open doors to understanding and communication, to give people the opportunity to walk in others' shoes, or whatever, you know, the phrases that we use, to see the world in different ways, then we need to be bringing the world's literature to them. And I'm constantly amazed when I go, well, within the IBI world, that people network and talk about various authors, and I've never read them because they've never been translated into English. And that saddens me enormously. So I suppose my big broad picture is that there's a world out there that we don't know. And it's partly, I think, because we have such an enormously powerful, creative and brilliant world of children's books within the UK. So there's a feeling that we don't need to look beyond that, because we've got our own very good people. But actually that's narrowing our children's access to the world and to their understanding of the world. So I'm on a mission, really, to try and bring some new thinking into how we do this. And there are some good people and some good publishers working in this area. So today we'll have the opportunity to talk more about that, I hope. But that's my broad picture, that if you're to be a citizen of the world and to follow IBI's mission of using children's books as a way of promoting international understanding, we need more access to the world's literature translated.
Great, thanks. Tom Bonnick, being one of the publishers who are part of that huge and monolithic great British publishing scene, can you tell us your perspective? Not to call you out, but Nosy Crow don't publish all that much in translation, but can you tell me, but you're very international at the same time, so can
yeah, of course. No, I'd be happy to. And actually, I mean, you know, you're quite right to call me out. And I should say, when I was invited to join this panel, I said, oh, well, you know, it sounds very interesting, but I'm not sure that I'm the best person to speak on it because we don't publish anything in translation. So what will I have to say? And actually, the perspective I can offer, which is why my invitation wasn't rescinded, was why publishers maybe do more in translation. You know, I don't want to defend the practice of not publishing more in translation, because philosophically, creatively, culturally, I agree with every word that Pam has said. And I think, you know, I would love for there to be more children's literature in translation. I think it's so incredibly important for all the reasons you so eloquently described. And I wouldn't disagree with a word of that. And I think it's interesting to consider why we don't do more of it. And I think, you know, there are some reasons that are sort of, I mean, there are some reasons that I think are, you know, that are cultural, I think, just in general, because the English language is such an enormous cultural export. We have a, you know, very ugly sort of tendency in so many walks of life to not expose ourselves to products from other countries, whether it's, you know, just language learning itself, whether it's film in translation, whether it's anything. I think, you know, there's a very unfortunate tendency to retain quite a narrow sort of perspective in sort of many cultural fields. I think publishing specifically, and children's publishing specifically, I think there are a few sort of business obstacles, I think, that get in the way of publishing more in translation. I mean, children, and the UK is an enormous net exporter of children's books, and children's publishers will tend to ask for and acquire much larger sort of grant of rights than, let's say, an adult publisher will. You know, in UK adult publishing, it's not uncommon for a publisher to acquire UK Commonwealth only rights, for instance, whereas in children's publishing, it's much more common to acquire world rights in all languages. And indeed, that Nosy Crow exclusively acquires world rights in all languages. And unfortunately, that sort of does then preclude publishing in translation, because if you're only acquiring world rights in all languages, you can't acquire something that's already been published in another language. The two sort of just, contradictions in terms. Nosy Crow in particular, but many children's publishers are built very much around the ability to exploit and sell international language rights. I think last year around 70% of our sales came from international. 70% of our revenue came from international sales, came from sales from outside of the UK. We wouldn't have been able to generate those sales if we didn't have the rights to sell on, either through co-editions, either through rights sales, through export sales, and so there is a sort of inherent conflict there, unfortunately, with publishing and translation. So it is, from my point of view, that's the big obstacle. I can't speak for a whole industry, but that's the big obstacle, perhaps, standing in Nosy Crow's way in particular, to publishing more in translation. But it simply, there's this sort of fundamental conflict with our business model, which is really about, a very outward looking perspective, but outward in the other direction. We're thinking about how can we create books that we think will appeal to countries and nationalities and languages around the world, rather than sort of the other way around.
Yeah. Sorry, just to follow up on that as well.
Yeah.
The translations you have done, what was the conversation then to get those books in? That if the vast part of your model is to kind of push out.
Oh, well, it's almost exclusive. I mean, I struggle to think of anything, in fact, that we bought in. I think the only titles we bought in from another publisher are some. We've got a very small bit of our novelty list, and we published, for instance, some soundboard books for babies, which were originally published by Gallimard Jeunesse in France. And the reason we acquired the English language or the UK rights for these sound books is just because they're such incredibly high quality sound books. They're just brilliant, but they have no text. They've got like 4 words in a book, and it was an exception because of just because there was a sort of technical, sort of format limitation to these books. They're very expensive to produce, the sound chips, etc. And so we bought those in. But other than that, we have, without exception, been the originating publisher of every single book on our list. Yeah. So because, as I say, so much our business model is based kind of heavily on the ability to sell rights.
Yeah. So I guess you would have quite a different perspective from the UK side, as you're selling rights as well, but you're also buying stuff in. And can you just kind of give me a flavor of what things are like for you, and maybe for perhaps the wider Arab world children's publishing?
I can speak for us. We have a little over 100 titles. So I did a bit of math last night, and 5% of our titles have been translated into English, and about 19% of our titles have been translated into 10 other languages. So if we combine the two, that's about 25% of our titles in translation. So I'm not sure if that's a good or bad or average number, but we haven't really focused that much on translating our books to other languages. We are a boutique publishing house, and we focus on, a bit like Tom, Nosy Crow, we focus on publishing original Arabic content that is great in quality and content, illustration, design, production, everything. So we haven't actually bought in yet. We really believe that we still have, our main role is to originate and create Arabic content. Having said that, we have attended Sharjah Book Fair, the professional program in Sharjah, and have signed translation contracts there. Our books have won awards and have been highlighted in the arablit.com blog, which has also attracted publishers to who engage with us, and we've signed contracts based on them being interested in a book that's been highlighted because it won an award. But we haven't really been that much focused on translating. But yeah, I believe in our content, and I believe that there's a lot of richness in our content to be translated even more, hopefully.
Pam, you sort of alluded to this when you're talking about the bigger picture, but maybe we can just make the case for why it's great to have these books cross borders. What are the benefits of, say, would be the benefits for more translation coming into the UK, for example?
Well, there are two aspects, I suppose, there are many aspects that I could talk about, but a couple. I mean, one of the things that I've always felt was that if I travel anywhere, I like to read a book from that country. And so I would always seek out a translation from that country to read. I find it gives me insight into the country. But we have a very diverse population in this country who don't need it for traveling, but they need it to keep in touch with the country of their family's origin, really. So there's a kind of need for children to be able to access books from their home language, but home country, which they may no longer speak, so they might need it in translation. So there's that point. But I do think that we gain an enormous understanding of the world by reading the stories, fiction and picture books from other parts of the world. And so it's about empathy and cultural understanding. I think it's a really important, it's an unspoken but a gentle tool to find out about the world, really. So that would be my motivation. And I think one of the key things for me is that, as Salwa's just mentioned about awards, that when you see the celebration around the world of various awards and you can't access the books because you don't read that language, it's very frustrating at times. And it's really exciting when you find one of the books that you've seen in Bologna winning the Bologna Ragazzi or various other things, suddenly someone has translated them. And I mean, like on Monday, I was at the Tate Modern and I saw that the book War by Jose Letria, this book, had been translated. And it was the last Bologna in 2019. It was a big book that was much talked about. He's a Portuguese illustrator and writer. And I was so excited and I thought, wow, that's wonderful. Someone's translated it into English. But I found it was a Canadian publisher, Greystone Kids, I now see have opened a UK branch. But it was very exciting to find that book. And I had quite a long conversation, in fact, with the people at the Tate who were selling it. So that was an award winner that's come into English. But I mean, one of the points I would make is that, say, the Hans Christian Andersen Award, which is the big children's book award in the world. I mean, last year's winners were, the last 2020 were Jacqueline Woodson, who is writing in English, but in America, but not published here. And yet she's a major international figure. And Albertine, who's a wonderful Swiss illustrator, writer. And no one will see those books here. But all around the world, in other countries, people are clamoring to translate them and publish them because they've become the Hans Christian Andersen Award winner. So there's a level of lack of knowledge that I think we need to address, that publishers could look between themselves at the award winners, at some of the big lists, which I can talk about later, to get more information about what's available that could be translated, because I think it adds to the cultural richness, really, of a very diverse country.
Yeah, every time I'm in Bologna when they announce the Hans Christian Andersen, I'm always kind of flabbergasted because I do the story, oh, blah, blah, blah has won the Hans Christian Andersen. So I look up the UK publisher and often, as you say, it's not to be found. Yeah, it's crazy.
And at the end of their lives, we get an IBI obituary for someone who has died and has been a major world player and we don't know the books at all. And it always makes me so sad. So, I mean, I think one of the key things would be wonderful if the UK publishers, when they're in Bologna, came out of their selling stalls and went and had a walk around, just to see the richness that there is out there, because sometimes I think they don't, I know they're so busy, but yeah. So I hope that answers some of the points, but I could go on.
Absolutely. Tom, Nosy Crow's model aside, with this kind of push into diversity and inclusion, which is a huge thing that Nosy Crow are doing very well with. Do you think that is maybe a route in for UK publishers to the sort of bring in the richness of other cultures in translation?
Yes, I think certainly. I mean, it certainly, there are ways in which the two sort of issues or questions overlap, absolutely. And so I think that it's, I think, there's absolutely ways in which addressing one issue would happen to address the other. I do think, though, that, I mean, I wouldn't tie them together entirely, though, because I think there's real value as well in looking at, ensuring that you're publishing authors from a diverse set of backgrounds who are also, kind of writing in English. I mean, there's no shortage actually of authors from different backgrounds, either in terms of ethnicity or sort of religion or sexuality or class or anything. There's no shortage of those people who are also writing in English. It's just about kind of publishers needing to really go out and find them properly, and making an effort to kind of reach out to those groups of people. So I don't want to sort of elide the two issues entirely and suggest that there are none of these people who are writing in English, because there are. We just historically not been very good at reaching out to them and finding them. I mean, I absolutely think that we would, again, as Pam said, I think it would culturally enrich us enormously if we did have a better track record of publishing in translation. But I do think, I mean, specifically on the question of sort of better diversity and inclusion in publishing, I wouldn't say that they're clearly overlapping issues, but I think I don't want to be so defeatist as to suggest that's the only way of addressing the other issue. I think we need to be doing much better at it. And I also think it's interesting, if you look at, I mean, I'm always struck, for instance, when I see picture books from the 80s, let's say. I've picked a decade at random there because that was the decade of my own sort of early infancy. When you see picture books that are by, let's say, African authors and illustrators, but published in the UK, they often fall back on the same sort of sets of cultural depictions and landscapes, because that's what the UK was publishing at the time. And so it's lots of kind of, African village scenes or kind of, market stalls and, animals in the savannah and people in traditional dress. And there's absolutely a place for those kinds of stories. But actually, how well do they reflect the experience of Black British children who are living in Britain? I think I would say that to give those children books in which they can recognise themselves, it's actually equally valuable that you publish books by Black British authors who are writing in English in the UK, because those, I think, there's a, to address that kind of question of, yes, our kind of diverse population, we should be publishing books that reflect their own lives here in the UK, as well as, let's say, kind of, from around the world. And, and I think there's obviously, there's questions of kind of historical publishing that sort of maybe has relied on particular tropes, but and I'm not suggesting the same thing goes on now. But yes, I think that they address different issues, perhaps, in a way. That was a long-winded answer.
And of course, I didn't mean to suggest that we shouldn't be doing that. I mean,
no,
that's
of course
one
not.
major
No,
part
absolutely.
of my work, obviously,
Yeah.
is to look at inclusion and diversity within the UK's author-illustrator groups.
And Salwa, do you think about this when those books that you have had translated? Do you think about the sort of mission, I guess, without being too airy-fairy about it, about what a good thing this is that those books are going into a new language? They're perhaps entertaining, of course, but perhaps educating people in those countries that they're going to.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's very rewarding that they're being translated into these languages, and I think it's so important to create that link, that sort of bridging cultures and highlighting the similarities between different cultures is key to create sort of like a hook and engage readers in reading the content. And once we have that, then we sort of have a captive audience who we can, exchange and give more ideas about different cultures in the book. So it's really important to have this diversity and inclusion of all cultures in publishing.
Yeah, I guess we should start getting into the weeds now, to sort of the specifics, because it's great to talk about these and kind of overarching things. But what can be done for, to get more translation into? Let's take, because 2/3 of the panel are from the UK. Let's take the UK. What are the sort of practical steps? Is it just simply a question, not just about changing a little bit, tweaking a little bit of the business models, but is it just translation funds being available? Maybe Pam, you can start us off with this. Are there sort of good practice of some? I know a lot of several UK publishers are doing a lot of translations. Are there things that governing bodies can do? What can be done?
Well, there are some very good examples of good practice. I mean, one of the leading ones is Pushkin Press, who you will know, and Adam Freudenheim has just written a really interesting article about his top 5 children's books in translation. And I've done other panels with him where he's talked about his mission to bring books here. He's a very good example of a publisher who's made a business out of doing books in translation and has a lot of expertise in the area. I'm very interested in an American publisher who distributes in the UK called Enchanted Lion, who also have a mission to publish translated books and have a great wealth of picture books in their list. So it's good to look at models and business practices of companies who are doing it, and other publishers who maybe have 1 or 2 translated titles in their lists. I suspect that it needs a different kind of marketing and promoting strategy. And so there's probably a discussion that publishers need to have around that. There are a great number of very skilled translators here who are used to working both ways, translating English to other languages. And, I would single out people like Daniel Hahn and Sarah Ardizzoni, who do great work in the whole translation area and do a lot of training and courses to help translators. So there's been some very good work there. There's also, and I've only more recently become aware of this, interesting work being done in schools with young people about the role of translation in their development. And there's work done by the Stephen Spender Education Trust, which I think is really worth looking up. And also, there are other projects that are good to look at. The other thing is about grants for translation, and I don't know a great deal about this, but I do know that there are some countries, particularly countries where their language is only spoken by a comparatively small number of people, like the Baltic states, who have quite good grants for helping for translations. And I know that Emma Press, for example, have published a lot of poetry in translation from the Baltics, or Book Island have also been the beneficiaries of some of those grants. So that's allowed books to come to England with a grant, with grant aid for the translation process. So there's kind of good models of practice that people can look at, and there are some grants to help and some very good and knowledgeable people working in the area if publishers are interested. I mean, I think it's quite a challenge to look at your list and think, is there a role that the translated books could play, and how many could we afford to do? Could we do 1 or 2? And I do think as well that there is the question of translated books and illustration, because there is a European particularly sensibility, or a South American sensibility, or an Arabic sensibility, and it would be good to have some of that come here as well. So there's an issue around translating picture books, which I think is quite a complicated one, but can be done very effectively. So, for example, Daniel Hahn has translated some of Roger Mello's books from Brazil absolutely amazingly, and it's good to have those here now.
Salwa, just in the books that you have sold that into translations, do you know, are the acquiring publishers beneficiaries of some funding model? Is that kind of the route to it? Have they benefited from that?
No. Yes, one was, or a couple were from the professional meetings in Sharjah. So they offer a grant based on that. And the other really was not a literal, not a translation. So that they've worked on retelling the story from our rough English translation of the story. So it was a retelling rather than an exercise of translating from Arabic to English. But mostly a lot were from Sharjah professional meetings sort of grant. So
if I can sort of take a punt here, that it was really helped by that sort of the money from basically if not the money from Sharjah, the sort of structure that's around where you can meet and other publishers can meet and the translators can get together. It has to be sort of that sort of kind of coming together.
Yeah, for us, this is what has helped pave the way to translations. It's meeting and creating relationships that then we could take in through email and like continue in terms of sending them our latest books every now and then, and sort of agreeing on email afterwards, and not in relation to the grant per se, but having that sort of platform is wonderful. I remember attending one of the first of these professional meetings, and just to be able to have that space and meet with international publishers was great for us. And this platform allowed for both exchanges, English whether or in Arabic to English. So yeah, it was very beneficial.
Yeah. So Tom, I want to follow up on something Pam alluded to about the role of the illustrator in all of this. I mean, does some illustration need to be translated as well? Because some illustrations don't work across cultures, do they?
No, it's interesting. I think illustration is one of those things in children's publishing that can sort of be a blessing and a curse when it comes to international selling, because for quite often your illustrator will be the thing that sells a book internationally, if it's a style of art that is particularly successful in other countries, and if it's a very illustration-led picture book, for instance. And equally, the flip side of that is if you have an art style that does feel very British, for instance, then it can put foreign publishers off. I think it does work both ways, and it's not just the art style, but for picture books as well, it's also, as well as the style of the art, it's what's contained in the art. A picture book, it's drawings of a lot of stuff, and if it's drawings of stuff that looks and feels unfamiliar to particular kind of audiences, then that is also going to prove to be an obstacle. So, I mean, historically, the kinds of subjects that have been tricky to tackle in picture books are, I mean, if you fill your picture book with lots of double-decker buses and red post boxes, then it's going to feel very British in a way that is likely to preclude international sales. If you have picture books set in schools, they can often be challenging because just schools look and feel very different in different parts of the world. The kind of the detail of what a classroom is like, and things like that can often be a challenge. But yes, I mean, art styles vary so much across the world, and I mean so much so that sometimes, particularly when I look at American children's fiction covers, I sometimes ask myself, is this a style I'm just not familiar with, or is it just a bad cover? Because I just cannot tell sometimes. I mean, it's a style that is so, American fiction covers feel so different to me that I just, I can't decode that sensibility. And so that does, I think it's it's opportunity. Sometimes it means opportunity. Sometimes it's, it's a challenge. I mean, we publish a lot of picture books by Axel Scheffler, for instance, the illustrator of the Gruffalo, and he's someone who's so popular and his work is so recognized around the world. But undeniably, that is going to be a huge benefit when you're kind of selling that book, if because his work is so beloved. But someone else working in a different style, you'll be in the opposite situation, certainly. So yes, it can go both ways, I think.
Yeah. Pam, do you have any thoughts on that, of the role the illustrator can play in helping with translation?
Well, I remember talking to Danny Hahn about a picture book that he translated, and talking about having to change the pacing of the words on the page. So it wasn't a question of taking the picture book and translating the words underneath the picture, but actually slightly changing the layout so that the pace of the story and the page turning elements were maintained, and the text wasn't as literal translation. And I think that's quite a complex area. But what I'm interested in is the way, I mean, as Tom said, the way that you find the cultural references through the picture books, because whilst obviously you don't want, I understand what you're saying about red buses and post boxes and so on, but sometimes that's absolutely fascinating. If you take the work of, say, Tom Schamp, who is Dutch, and just look at the cultural references he has in the picture books, because that's the way that helps you to understand what it's like in another country. But I can see that there are some places that it's very difficult to do that, with schools and so on. But I'm also interested in the style of illustration, the variety of illustration styles that you find if you look at it, if you look around the world. I mean, I think that there is a difference in Mexico, for example, or Brazil, or in some of the some Spanish illustrators. They have a different approach to illustration, and I find it very exciting to be able to encounter different styles, even though we have wonderful illustrators in this country who are also doing all sorts of different things. But there are other styles of illustration, and it's good. I think it's good for young people here to have the opportunity to see them. So that's partly what I'm referring to. And then the other thing is the whole question of wordless picture books, which is something I'm particularly interested in, and which, if anyone is interested, you can find the various IBI lists. They're called silent books in IBI, but that's where the picture has to convey the whole meaning. And it's not a format that is very widely published in the UK, but I think is a very exciting and very useful format. And that is ironically where we translate quite a lot of titles, because we don't have an indigenous kind of collection, really. So that's another area where illustration carries its own, I think.
So just on that, why don't you think it's popular in the UK? Because every Bologna I go to, I think it's an IBI exhibition where there's a bunch of wordless picture panels from wordless picture books, and they're amazing. But almost never a UK illustrator is doing one yet. Why don't you think it chimes with the British sensibility?
Yes, I have actually no idea. I mean, I've thought about this long and hard, and I really don't know why. I think it's maybe, I don't know, maybe it's about interpretation and reading illustrations, and maybe we're not confident about doing that. I don't know. But when you talk to the people who do the selection for the silent books exhibition in Bologna, they say that over the years they've become more complex, more philosophical, more challenging, willing to look at a broad range of subjects. It's a long tradition. I mean, I've looked at some of the early Soviet wordless picture books, absolutely extraordinary and brilliant in conveying really complex messages. But there's not been a legacy of it here, and I really don't know why. I'm sure someone else might be able to explain. Tom might know. I don't know. You might know. But I would like to see more, because I think they have a great place to play.
I mean, I do. I'm sorry to jump in there. I love wordless picture books myself. I'm a great fan, and you're right, we don't publish in some of them in the UK. I mean, I'm a huge fan of, I think they were published in the US originally, but the series that Walker published, illustrated by Aaron Becker, I think are just beautiful, Journey and so on. And again, I mean, they are, I think they are viewed, there's an image of them as being quite sort of uncommercial here. You know, they're not the kinds of picture books you're likely to see on supermarket shelves, for instance. And I think it is it's interesting to consider why. I mean, we were talking about this a little while ago, and I think one of the reasons I think there's maybe not a larger market for them is because, ironically, although they are often easier for a young child to interpret, because you can interpret the story through the pictures. You're asked to interpret the story through the pictures, and that's hugely valuable for children, you know, who aren't confident readers, perhaps, or aren't reading at all yet, or aren't, you know, English speakers. And it's, you know, it's great for parents who maybe aren't, you know, fluent readers as well, or aren't fluent English readers. I think for the you know, the market of what is thought of as the sort of typical market for commercial picture book readers, wordless picture books, they put quite a high place quite high demands on an adult. I think, you know, I'm speaking as the parent of a toddler. I'm very used to reading my daughter picture books, well, you know, all the time. But in the evening, let's say before bedtime, we read picture books, and it is not a demanding or strenuous activity for me. I can sort of read Tiger Who Came to Tea on autopilot while thinking about something entirely different. And you can't, you know, when you're reading reading a wordless picture book, you have to do a lot of work as the adult reading to a child. You have to interpret the story and kind of come up with a text yourself, and it places a lot of demands on you, and you can't kind of switch off and think about, you know, the glass of wine you're about to have afterwards. It puts you through your paces as a parent, and I think that takes a more confident reader, ironically, than someone you know, who doesn't kind of feel as comfortable with the process. If you know, I think so for a lot of parents, I think it just looks like a bit too much work, perhaps, if you have to kind of create a story out of thin air, or create a text out of thin air, which can, you know, and it's a wonderful experience if you if you really work at it and try hard enough, because it's such a, you know, it encourages so much creativity, and, you know, you can kind of, it's absolute, I can't sort of recommend it enough, but I think it does put a higher burden on an adult reading to a child, which I think has probably limited its place in a sort of wider sort of commercial environment to some extent.
And so I'll just take a step back, because I didn't get your perspective on this. What role do you think the illustrator plays in the selling of translations? And
I could speak from experience. We have a book which I actually grabbed. It's called and so in this instance, the author was from Palestine and the illustrator is Slovenian. And so we wanted the location to be in Palestine. So we sent her references of the houses, how they look, just the environment and in general, the houses from inside. And she did such a beautiful job. She even won in the BIB awards, Bratislava Illustration Award. And I think also that this is what attracted, along with it winning an award, a US publisher to take on the book. And it's going to be in English, published in the next year. So I think illustrations play a beautiful, quiet role in just giving a sense of the place. Without the story is absolutely global, but it's just the setting, the houses from inside, cultural references like clothes, like how the houses look. It gives so much valuable and rich information that doesn't need to be really in the text. It's just enjoyed with the book, and it makes it so rich and special.
Actually, I was just thinking about this, an issue that's kind of really a hot button one for translators in the adult sphere, about having translators' names on the covers. How do you publishers feel about that? How do you, maybe Salwa?
I think it's very important. I think they've done the work of the author in that language. So yes, they should be on the cover, and I think it's credit for them, and it's due.
Yeah. What's IBI's stance on this,
Equally, I agree with Salwa. I think it's terribly important. And the IBI Honour List, which is published every 2 years, one of the categories is books in translation. And that is to honour the translator. And that is a fabulous list for anyone who wants to look it up. I mean, they've been doing it for many years, so you get a long legacy there. But it's always very interesting when we're coming to select the British entries for that list. I mean, we have to choose one, and several years ago there wouldn't be much choice. Of recent years there has been much more choice, which is good. But I think it's terribly important. I mean, even as an adult reader, I get terribly frustrated if I don't know who's done the translation. I want to know who they are and where they are, and you can find 2 different translations of older books and really notice the difference. And I mean, I've been to some of the events that Daniel Hahn has organised of Translation Nation, where you get 2 translators discussing, the minutiae of where the comma goes, and it's absolutely fascinating. So I think it's terribly important to honour their role. I think it's a very, very important part of the process.
Yeah. How about you, Tom? It would be churlish to say you didn't want the translator on the cover.
Yes,
at this point.
No, entirely. Yeah, no. I mean, as I've said, sadly, it's a bit of a hypothetical for us at the moment, but I'm, all in favour of it for absolutely all the reasons that have been discussed. I think, just from a commercial point of view, I think it's very valuable, and particularly as, in many cases, the translator can be a bigger name than the originating author, and I think why wouldn't you? It's the conversation that has been had maybe more loudly within children's books has been around giving illustrators proper credit. Sarah McIntyre has spearheaded over many years the Excuse Me in Business campaign to properly acknowledge illustrators in books, and I think there's very similar arguments in both cases. They are absolutely there. They absolutely should be recognised properly. Not just on a cover, but through the information that Nielsen provides, through the feeds that the publishers send out to retailers, wherever and whenever they can be. I think, and yes, as I said, absolutely the same should be true for the translation, certainly.
Yeah.
I mean, the one except, I mean, the only area where that becomes slightly complicated, I guess, is in the case of a lot of picture books that are published in translation in the UK. They're quite often translated in-house, and so it's maybe not so relevant. I don't think you need to credit your own publishing house if that's where a translation has come from. But where there's a named translator, I think they absolutely should receive credit.
Yeah. What role do and I guess this, maybe we'll start off with you for this, Tom, because this kind of refers to not just translated books, but all books, I guess, when you're selling abroad. But what role do the cultural sensitivities, taboos that are in one country but not in the other play when you're thinking about selling abroad? I mean, I imagine people would have difficulty selling an LGBTQ book into China, for example, at the moment. Or
yeah, I mean, it's those sorts of questions come up all the time, and there are lots of just countless examples. I mean, just on that point, a book that I'm publishing next year, wonderful debut, which was presented recently at the Frankfurt Book Fair in person. Our rights team attended Frankfurt. I think they were the only UK publisher to do so. And a book that I'm publishing, as I mentioned, it's a middle grade title. It features very incidentally, a same-sex relationship as the parents of a sort of secondary character. And that was enough to turn off some foreign publishers who just didn't feel that would be appropriate for their market. So, those kinds of sensitivities do present challenges often. I mean, the classic example is when you do, young books of farm animals, then putting pigs on the cover, for instance, means you're less likely to sell that book into predominantly Muslim countries. That's almost the cliched example of maybe a sort of where one set of cultural whatever don't necessarily translate overseas. So yes, it's something that we think about a lot, and in some cases we may accommodate those sensitivities, and in some cases, as in the case of maybe LGBT representation, we may not accommodate it. We may actually say, okay, well, we can't sell that book to these countries. So it kind of, those sort of issues can vary topic to topic, country to country. But yes, I mean, absolutely, it's something that you think about a lot when you're publishing with an international point of view.
And Salwa, what do you think of those sort of issues when you're thinking about selling your books abroad? Do you think, or is it just you get the book you get?
Yeah, we really scrutinize the scripts that we get, and we make sure that we start with the really good content. We don't think of the international scene really that much, but I think if the taboo is major to the story, then yes, it will be a deterrent to a translate. But if the publisher and the author is willing to compromise, or let's say remove this or that, then a translation could happen if proper communication between both is agreed. But we don't have experience in anything that was like rejected, to be honest.
Yeah. And Pam, what have you seen? And has this been a difficulty in sometimes not having a book as widely translated as possible? Sorry.
I think Tom has summed it up really well, really. I think that he's identified the arena where a lot happens, and I think the most difficult times have been when a book has been changed without the author being consulted, and that's led to sort of some very difficult areas, and we've had some examples of that in recent months around the LGBTQ area. So I think that's quite problematic. I think there are countries that are braver and publish more than we do sometimes. So, some of the Scandinavian discussions in books are quite a shock to us. So they don't, we wouldn't necessarily have seen them here, but I know of books that haven't been published because they've been a little bit more risky than we're able to cope with. And I think there is a whole issue around the area of being naked in books and what's acceptable there.
I was going to say exactly. So yeah, Scandinavian books are so much. I read some of them like open mouthed at what they get away with. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So there are different cultural sensibilities and different braveries, but I think that the main thing is never to change a book without the author's permission or the illustrator's permission, because that is an area where you're really doing some infringement, which is really wrong, I think.
We just have a few minutes left, so maybe we should wrap up. Can I just ask all of you to kind of, well, first of all, if there's one or two translated authors, you might have authors that haven't been translated widely that you'd like to see across the world. Tom Bonnick just sighed. But and maybe just to follow that up, ideally, what do you think? How would you like translation to grow in the next few years? Maybe Salwa can start with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, 25% of our books have been translated, which goes to show that the quality and content of our illustrations and books, there's value in them for the publishing industry. So publishing industry in the Arab world is evolving. There's a lot of hidden talent. There's a lot of richness. So I'm very optimistic to see more public translations happening from Arabic to other languages.
Yeah. And Tom?
I mean, I fervently hope that publishing more in translation is something that more publishers in the UK, including my own, will start to do and will do more of. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about kind of ways into that area, and I had intended to single out Danny Hahn for praise as well, because I think he does fantastic work in trying to facilitate more publishers doing this, and he is he can find grants for you, and he can find translators, and he can do all kinds of things. I mean, I'm looking at I think publishing translation there's great opportunities if you're publishing into new areas. So for instance, there's such a growing market at the moment in the UK for graphic novels, and I think publishing those in translation is a fantastic way of entering that market for the publishers who haven't had any experience of publishing that format themselves, because you've got this kind of ready-made product effectively. So I think there's huge opportunity there for kind of new bits of the market to look overseas and see what already exists. And I mean, I do think it's a market that will grow. I think there's we've said there are publishers like Pushkin who are doing a fantastic job of it. So yes, I do feel optimistic, I suppose.
And Pam?
I'm very interested in the Arab world. I think we have not seen the publications of the Arab children's literature world very much in the UK. So I think there's a real opportunity there. I would particularly mention Ibtisam Barakat, who won the Sheikh Zayed Award in 2019 for a book called Lilac Girl, which is about Palestine. And it's so full of insight and referencing. It would be really great to see that published here. I feel very passionately that we should be looking at ways of publishing people who win the Hans Christian Andersen Award for illustration and for their writing, because they're people who are being commemorated for a lifetime achievement, and it's a very rigorous selection process, so we know they're people who are top of their game. So I think it's a very exciting time, and I look forward to finding more about countries where we would really gain from an insight about that life in that country by the writers of and illustrators from that country. So I just hope we see more of it. But yes, those would be my starting points, I think, to the Hans Christian Andersen and other award winners. That's what I'd like to see.
All right, brilliant. Well, thanks so much, all three of you, Salwa Shakhshir, Tom Bonnick, and Pam Dix. I feel we could probably talk about this for hours and hours, but we only have an hour. Thanks for everyone for tuning in. And again, we shall be posting this on the Bookseller YouTube site quite soon, so look out for that. Again, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.